Black woman helps humiliated. Stranger at gas station. Days later, a military convoy arrives for her. They called it just another Tuesday in Jackson Hollow, Georgia, but what happened at the gas station that morning would burn into the town's memory like scorched pavement under a July sun. It started with a low growl, the kind you feel before you hear it. A battered pickup truck rolled into Mason's pit stop, coughing smoke and running on fumes. Behind the wheel sat a man who looked like he'd survived a dozen lives. White, mid-40s, buzz-cut hair. Marine Corps tattoo faded into sun-scorched skin. His stare cold and guarded. Nobody recognized him. That alone made him a threat. This was Jackson Hollow, after all, a place where outsiders were eyed like stray dogs. And trust was something passed down through bloodlines, not earned with kindness. The pump clicked. The man stepped out. No wallet, no mobile signal, just a tank to fill and a town full of eyes already suspicious of the way he moved, the way he didn't speak unless necessary. The cashier, Kenny, known more for his temper than his customer service, stepped outside, voice raised enough to draw attention. "You think this is some kind of charity stop, huh?" he barked. "Ain't got cash, ain't got gas. Simple math." A few locals sipping burnt coffee on the store steps leaned in, already amused. "Probably trying to pull some veteran sob story," one muttered. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there, jaw tight, hands raised in a calm that only made people more uncomfortable. "Just need to get to my mom. She's not well. I can Venmo, Apple Pay, whatever you use." Kenny snorted. "We don't do tech here, buddy. You want gas? You pay like a man." The crowd chuckled, satisfied with the show. That's when she appeared. Raven Harris. Black, mid-30s, tall, natural curls pulled back tight, wearing jeans with paint stains and a t-shirt that said Second Wind Center across the front. She didn't speak right away. She saw the man, saw the crowd, saw the weight in his shoulders. Then, with quiet certainty, she walked up, slipped a 20 into the register, and said clearly, "His gas is on me." Dead silence. Kenny blinked. "You serious?" Raven didn't blink. "Dead serious." Someone in the back scoffed. "Figures. That center of hers must be for suckers, too." Raven ignored it, eyes locked on the man as she added, "You don't owe me anything." He looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't. Instead, he just whispered, "Thank you," and began fueling up. The moment passed, but the silence left behind buzzed louder than any words. The man drove off. Raven disappeared into her dented sedan and pulled away. No one knew her name. No one knew his. But 3 days later, when a military convoy of Humvees and black SUVs came roaring down Main Street, headed straight for Jackson Hollow, the town would remember. And they'd finally ask, who the hell was she? And what did she just set in motion? Raven didn't tell anyone what happened that morning at the gas station. She didn't need to. In a town like Jackson Hollow, word moved faster than trucks on I-75. By noon, everyone had their own version. She paid for a drifter's gas. He was probably dangerous. Why's she always stepping into things that ain't her business? But Raven had grown used to that kind of talk. She didn't flinch at whispers. She didn't shrink when people stared. She simply drove back to the edge of town, past the overgrown baseball field and rusted-out billboards, to the place where her purpose lived. A fading one-story building with peeling white paint and a crooked sign that read, Second Wind Center. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The center had started as a half-formed dream. A home for the ones no one else would take. The forgotten veterans. The kids tossed around by the foster system. The folks haunted by things they couldn't talk about. Raven had seen too many of them fall through the cracks, labeled as problems instead of people. So with her savings, her bare hands, and a stubborn heart, she built this place. Some nights, she wondered if it mattered. The center was underfunded, understaffed, and overworked. The plumbing barely held together. The pantry was usually half empty. Some weeks they scraped by on donations and dignity alone. And still, she showed up, every day. Because even when the town didn't believe in second wind, Raven did. That afternoon she pulled into the gravel lot, dust trailing behind her like a quiet storm. Inside, Mr. George sat by the window in his wheelchair, watching the trees sway. His white hair was combed neatly, his posture stiff despite the pain she knew he tried to hide. "You're late," he said without looking at her. His voice was dry but familiar, gruff with years and unspoken affection. "Had to stop by the pit stop," she replied, setting her keys on the side table. "Gas prices won't drop themselves." He gave her a sideways glance. "You stirred something, didn't you?" She smiled faintly. "What makes you think that?" George chuckled, then grew quiet. "They'll talk. This town always does." Raven leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Let them. That man needed help. Nobody else was going to do it." George nodded, slow and deliberate. "I know. That's why I trust you with this place. Because when it comes down to it, you act. Not because it's safe or popular, but because it's right." His words hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, the exhaustion showed in her eyes. The years of being the only one fighting, the only one believing. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. That night, she sat in her tiny office at the back of the center, sorting through paperwork and overdue bills. She didn't think about the man at the gas station. Not really. Just a stranger passing through. Someone she'd probably never see again. But outside, beyond the cracked asphalt and the quiet trees, something had shifted. Something was moving. And Raven Harris had no idea that the next time she'd hear an engine roar down Jackson Hollow, it wouldn't be a stranger looking for gas. It would be the past catching up, and the beginning of a reckoning the town wasn't ready for. It started with a sound. Not the hum of cicadas or the clatter of the center's loose gutter in the wind. Those were familiar, almost comforting. This was different. A deep, rumbling growl that rolled across the earth like distant thunder. Raven stood in the hallway, a clipboard in one hand and a half-drunk cup of coffee in the other, frozen mid-step. Her eyes narrowed. Mr. George heard it too. From his place near the window, he shifted slightly in his chair and muttered, "That ain't no delivery truck." Raven set the clipboard down on the reception desk and walked out onto the porch. The air was still, heavy with late summer heat. Dust hung low like it didn't dare rise. And then they appeared. First one, then another, and then 6 more, all in perfect formation. Military-style Humvees, matte black with tinted windows, tires grinding against the gravel like they meant to leave a mark. 2 dark SUVs followed at the rear, and behind them, a weathered truck with government plates. Raven's heart rate picked up, though her face stayed calm. Her fingers curled around the coffee cup tighter. The engines roared for a moment longer, then died off one by one. Doors opened. Boots hit the ground. A line of figures stepped out, dressed not in uniform, but in a deliberate kind of utility. Plain shirts, tactical pants, badges tucked at their sides. Some with clipboards, others with toolkits, medical bags, radio packs. And leading them, walking steady and sure, was the man from the gas station. Caleb. His boots crunched across the lot as he approached the porch. The same dusty jeans, same buzz cut, but now the posture was unmistakably different. Authoritative, centered, eyes sharp and scanning. Raven didn't move. She didn't have to. "You're hard to find," Caleb said, voice even but edged with something raw. "Then again, you weren't trying to be found, were you?" Raven raised a brow. "You brought quite the welcome committee." "Didn't want to come empty-handed," he replied, then paused. "Mind if we talk?" Raven gestured toward the steps. "You're already on my porch. Might as well finish the trip." Caleb climbed the steps but stopped short of crowding her. "I didn't thank you properly the other day." "Didn't need to," Raven said flatly. "Wasn't looking for thanks." Caleb nodded once, slowly. "I know. That's why I'm here." Behind him, his team had begun unloading boxes, stacked crates labeled with government insignia, others marked Veteran Services, Emergency Trauma Support, Field Medical Supplies. Raven glanced past his shoulder. "You here on assignment?" "Something like that," Caleb said. "I run a federal veterans transition initiative, post-combat reintegration, mental health, long-term housing. We go where we're needed. Usually we're invited." "You weren't invited here," she said, eyes locked. "No, I wasn't." He didn't flinch. "But I looked up your center. I saw the registry, saw the permits you filed, the ones that keep getting lost by the town clerk's office. I've seen that before. In other towns. Towns that don't like people like us trying to fix what they won't even admit is broken." Raven's jaw tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Caleb continued, voice softer now. "You helped me when you had no reason to. When I was being treated like trash by a town that didn't know me. That stuck with me. I don't forget things like that." "So you brought a convoy?" Raven said dryly. "What? Thought a truckload of supplies would fix Jackson Hollow?" Caleb gave a faint smile, not unkind. "I didn't come to fix the town. I came to back you up. The supplies are for your center. We're here to help you keep it running, and if the people around here want to get in the way—" His smile faded. "They'll have to deal with me." For the first time, Raven blinked, not out of fear, but out of something quieter, something like surprise. Mr. George had wheeled himself out onto the porch by then, watching silently. Caleb turned to him and gave a small, respectful nod. "Sir." George looked the man up and down. "Marine?" "Once," Caleb said. "Still a fighter, though." "We'll see," George replied, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. Raven crossed her arms. "You expect people here to just accept this? You show up with Humvees and government seals and think they'll roll out the red carpet?" "No," Caleb said. "I expect them to be angry, suspicious, maybe even scared. But I also expect a few of them to come around, because they'll see we're not here to take over. We're here to do the work they refuse to." Raven looked down at the crates now being lined up along the driveway. She recognized medical gear, fresh food containers, even a generator. Her breath caught in her throat for a brief second. "You came all the way back. For this?" "For you," Caleb corrected gently. "Because you reminded me what this is supposed to be about." A long silence stretched between them. Then Raven said quietly, "You're gonna make things messy." "They're already messy," he said. "Let's at least make 'em matter." Behind them, the other team members began opening folding tables, organizing equipment, unloading more supplies. The gravel lot turned into a makeshift operations base in less than 10 minutes, and down the road, just out of sight, eyes were already watching. Phones were being picked up. Conversations were starting. Rumors blooming like weeds. Because in Jackson Hollow, nothing stirred without someone trying to dig it up or bury it fast. Raven stepped down from the porch, walking toward the crates. She ran her hand over one marked Emergency Trauma Kits, Tier A. She exhaled slowly. "You know they're going to come for us, right?" "Let 'em," Caleb said behind her. "We've got more fight in us than they expect." Raven turned, a flicker of something fierce in her eyes. "Good. Because I'm done asking for space. It's time this town remembers what compassion looks like, whether they like it or not." Caleb grinned. "Now you sound like a commander." And for the first time in a long while, Raven allowed herself the smallest smile. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a line in the dirt. And in Jackson Hollow, that was more than enough to start a war. Or a revolution. The first full day after the convoy arrived was quiet. Too quiet. Raven knew the silence wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that settled just before a storm rolled through. The townspeople weren't knocking on the doors with pitchforks, but they weren't exactly welcoming either. They watched. From behind lace curtains, from rocking chairs on front porches, from behind tinted windshields parked just a little too long near the center's driveway. By mid-morning, Raven was back in the thick of it, inventorying the medical crates, supervising a makeshift clinic being assembled in the back room, and dodging questions from reporters who were already sniffing for tension. Word had spread fast. Jackson Hollow might be isolated, but drama moved through small towns like wildfire. Raven stepped into the side yard where two of Caleb's team were clearing brush near the broken fencing. The smell of fresh wood and earth clung to the air. Sweat beaded along her brow, and she swiped it with the sleeve of her shirt. A child's laughter floated through the air from behind the center. Ella and Marcus, two of the kids staying long-term, were being taught basic first aid by a veteran medic named Nina. It was the first time in weeks Raven had heard them laugh like that. But just as quickly as that piece settled, it cracked. Tires crunched in the gravel out front, and a sharp, commanding voice cut through the air. "Raven Harris, you need to step outside." Raven stiffened. She recognized that voice. Deputy Tom Granger, old school, suspicious of everything unfamiliar, allergic to change, and especially hostile to anything he couldn't control. Raven rounded the corner of the building and saw Granger standing next to his cruiser, one hand resting on his holster in that subtle way meant to intimidate. Behind him, two town officials, Councilwoman Jean Fletcher and Permit Officer Rick Marston, stood with clipboards and sour expressions. Granger's voice carried over the yard. "You've got an unauthorized operation running here, Raven. Military-grade vehicles, unregistered medical practice, and multiple complaints of suspicious activity." Raven didn't flinch. Suspicious activity like helping people. Jean stepped forward, her tone sharp. "You don't have zoning approval for a temporary clinic, and I have here a motion from the town council to suspend your operating license pending full review." Rick held out the document, trying to look official but not meeting her eyes. Raven crossed her arms. "And what exactly is this review based on?" Granger smirked. "Public safety. You're attracting the wrong kind of attention. This isn't a military base." Before Raven could respond, Caleb stepped out from behind her, his presence instantly shifting the mood. He wasn't wearing a badge or uniform, but the way he moved, calm, direct, made it clear he'd dealt with worse. "Deputy, Councilwoman," he said evenly. "I'm Captain Caleb Walker, Department of Veteran Affairs. We are here on a federally sanctioned outreach operation under Title 38 authority. This facility falls under emergency provision support due to its existing veteran residency." Granger blinked. "Title what?" Caleb didn't repeat himself. He simply reached into the pocket of his cargo pants and handed over a laminated credential and signed authorization letter. Jean read it slowly, color rising in her face. "You never filed for this," she snapped. "Didn't need to," Caleb replied. "You didn't return the last 3 filings Raven made, remember?" Rick shifted uncomfortably. Raven took a small step forward. "We're not breaking laws. We're filling gaps your office keeps ignoring." Granger's lips thinned. "That may be, but this town has a way of doing things. Quietly. Privately." "Too quietly," Caleb said. "So quietly that people slip through the cracks, don't they?" There was a beat of silence. Jean turned sharply. "This isn't over. The council will be holding a vote. And if we decide this center is in violation, you'll be shut down, federal or not." "You go ahead," Raven said. "But remember, there are people watching this town now. People who won't let it hide behind closed doors and broken systems. Granger turned without a word and got into his cruiser, slamming the door harder than necessary. The engine roared and kicked up dust as he peeled out of the driveway. Rick and Jean followed in their car. No goodbye, just silence and sour stares. When they were gone, Caleb exhaled and turned to Raven. That was the quiet part of the storm. Raven gave a short nod. I know. They're going to try everything they can to bury this place. Caleb looked out at the yard, at the kids laughing again, at George supervising a younger vet hammering fence posts. Then we dig in. Over the next few hours, the center buzzed with renewed energy. Raven and Caleb worked side by side, sorting, training, answering phones. A woman from a neighboring county called to ask if they had space for her brother, who'd just come back from deployment and was showing signs of severe PTSD. A retired nurse showed up with a box of supplies and asked if she could volunteer. And slowly, like shutters opening in a storm, the town began to peek out. A man from the hardware store dropped off nails and lumber without a word. 2 high school seniors from down the road asked if they could help with the garden. And that night, just after sunset, a familiar clatter of metal and leather approached. Raven stepped onto the porch to see a row of motorcycles glinting under the streetlight. Not military. Bikers. Some from the next town over, some farther out. At the head of the group was a tall black woman in a leather vest, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. She stepped forward. You, Raven? Raven nodded. We heard what happened. We've been watching the headlines. Word spreads in our kind of circle. Thought maybe it's time someone stood on your side. Raven looked past her at the dozen riders behind her. All quiet. All waiting. You brought backup? Nah, the woman said with a wry smile. We brought family. Raven swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Then she stepped aside and held the door open. Then come on in. We've got work to do. And for the first time that day, the air around Second Wind felt less like a battle line and more like a front porch filled with possibility. The next morning broke with a haze hanging low over Jackson Hollow, the sun pushing stubbornly through the thick southern air like it, too, had something to prove. Inside Second Wind, the clatter of coffee cups and the low hum of morning routines filled the space with an almost normal rhythm. But Raven knew better than to trust the quiet. She could feel it in her bones. The tension hadn't broken. It had just retreated to reload. She stood by the kitchen sink, rinsing out a pan, when George rolled in, newspaper folded under one arm, eyebrows already lifted. Front page, he said without preamble, setting the paper on the counter. Raven dried her hands and opened it. There, in bold print just above the fold, were the words, Outsiders bring military muscle to Jackson Hollow. Town divided over relief efforts. Beneath it, a blurry photo captured her mid-step, flanked by Caleb and one of the medics, crates in the background, the American flag overhead. Yet the angle twisted the scene, made it look like an invasion rather than a restoration. Raven exhaled sharply. They're trying to spin it. George snorted. Of course they are. They don't like change they didn't vote for. Just then, a knock hit the front door. Not sharp, not angry. Measured. When Raven opened it, she found 2 people she never expected to see on her porch. Pastor Willard Hayes and his wife, Martha. He was a quiet man with gray at his temples and a Bible always tucked under one arm. Martha was more vocal, especially about what she called the old ways. They weren't cruel, just cautious, traditional. But tradition, Raven had learned, was often just another word for fear in fancy clothes. Ms. Harris, Pastor Willard said gently, removing his hat. We'd like to talk. Raven nodded slowly. Come in. They sat in the common room, sun filtering in through the blinds, dust motes dancing in the light. Martha clasped her purse in her lap like it might float away. Willard cleared his throat. We've been watching. We've heard the stories. And well, we've also heard a few of our own parishioners changing their tune. Raven waited. He continued. There's a woman in our congregation. Her grandson served 2 tours. He came back a shell. Won't talk to anyone. She said she saw one of your people, Nina, speaking to him behind the diner. He didn't run away. He listened. Martha finally spoke, voice softer than Raven expected. She said he even nodded once. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Pastor Willard leaned forward, setting his hat down. I'm not here to offer support just because it's convenient. But I do believe in service, and in grace. If what you're doing here, if it's helping people, we'd like to offer a meal, a fundraiser, at the church hall, to support the center. Raven blinked, unsure if she heard right. You want to host a fundraiser? Martha nodded, lips tight. It won't be fancy, but it'll be public, and some people need permission to care. Seeing us stand with you, it might give them that. Raven felt her throat tighten, not because she needed their help, but because they offered it anyway. She nodded slowly. Thank you, truly. After they left, she stood for a long moment, hands on her hips, mind racing. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a crack in the dam, a real one. By mid-afternoon, Caleb had news of his own. He found Raven outside, near the raised garden beds, where Marcus and Ella were weeding under the watchful eye of one of the bikers, a woman named Jazz, with arms like steel and a laugh that could scare thunder. We've got an issue, Caleb said, voice low. The council's pushing up the vote. They're trying to pass an emergency ordinance to reclassify this property. Raven turned. Which means, he said, they'd have the power to shut you down by the weekend. No appeal, no federal protections. Even with your paperwork? She asked. Caleb grimaced. If the state votes to override the designation, they can force us into a holding pattern. And you know how long those can last. Months. Years. Raven looked at the kids, their hands dirty, their laughter real. Then back at Caleb. So they want to fight? They want you to fold, Caleb said. To walk away before it turns into a media circus. Raven shook her head. They don't know me very well. That night, as the sun dipped behind the pine trees and the heat finally loosened its grip, Raven called a meeting in the common room. Staff, volunteers, veterans. Even George wheeled himself to the front with that sharp, no-nonsense look in his eye. She didn't speak from a podium. She stood by the coffee table, arms crossed, voice clear. They're voting to erase us, to erase this place. And the truth is, they might win. They've got power, money, lawyers. But they don't have what we've got. She paused. They don't have our grit. They don't have our stories. They don't have our scars. Or our reasons to keep showing up anyway. Caleb stepped up beside her, arms folded. So here's what we're gonna do. We fight. With words. With presence. We show up at that vote. We speak. We stand. And we let the town see that Second Wind isn't just a building. It's people. It's faces. It's survival. Murmurs filled the room. Then nods. Then claps. Raven looked around at the worn couches, the flickering light above the fridge, the chipped paint on the window trim. She'd never loved anything more in her life. And tomorrow, for the first time, she wouldn't be the only one fighting to protect it. The day of the vote arrived with an eerie stillness hanging over Jackson Hollow, the kind of stillness that made even the birds seem cautious. Raven stood in front of the mirror in the tiny office she used as both storage room and workspace, adjusting the collar of her plain black button-down. No logos, no slogans, no messages, just dignity. She didn't dress to impress, she dressed to be heard. Outside, the gravel crunch of arrivals began. Caleb, in a clean, pressed shirt that still somehow looked like battle gear. George, wearing his old army jacket over slacks, his service medals pinned proudly on one side. Jazz and the other bikers, leather swapped for denim and vests patched with years of road and redemption. The kids would stay behind, guarded and occupied by Nina and a few volunteers. This was a battle for grown folks. By noon, the town hall was fuller than it had been in years. People Raven hadn't seen in months were now packed into pew-like benches. Shopkeepers, retirees, parents, pastors, and plenty who came just to spectate, waiting to see what kind of trouble the girl from the edge of town had stirred up this time. At the front sat the council, Jean Fletcher in her signature red blazer, lips tight with forced politeness, Rick Marston glancing nervously at every whisper, and Councilman Dalton Green, the oldest member, who had mastered the art of pretending to be neutral while doing nothing at all. Granger stood near the back wall, arms folded, his badge catching the fluorescent lights like a silent threat. Raven stepped forward when her name was called. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need to. Her voice, though calm, carried the force of someone who had lived every word she spoke. You all know me, or at least you think you do. I'm not here to argue zoning codes or permits. I'm here because this vote isn't about land. It's about people. People you've spent years ignoring, discarding, judging. I built Second Wind for the ones nobody else would. I opened my doors to veterans you left to rot, to kids you said were too broken, to families this town quietly pretended didn't exist. And now that it's working, now that it's visible, you want to shut it down? She paused, letting the silence grow heavy. I won't let you. Because this place, it's not just a building. It's a promise. That we are not what happened to us. That we are more than statistics, or burdens, or whispers, behind coffee cups. Then she stepped back. Caleb followed. He spoke of federal law, of trauma statistics, of successful programs in other towns. But what made people sit up straighter wasn't the data. It was the quiet anger in his voice, the kind that said he'd bled for this country and didn't come here to beg for permission. After him came George, whose words were slower, but no less piercing. I served in Nam, came back to silence, to shame. This town watched me fall apart, then watched her. He gestured toward Raven. Put me back together. If you vote to close that place, you better be ready to look every one of us in the eye and explain why. One by one, others spoke. A mother whose teenage son found safety at Second Wind after being kicked out. A veteran from the next county who said Nina saved his life with one conversation. Even Pastor Willard stood, offering not scripture, but simple truth. We claim to be a town of faith, but faith without action is empty, and turning our backs on people who need us the most is not what any God I know would condone. Then the council recessed for a closed vote. As the crowd murmured, Raven stood near the back, eyes fixed on the polished floor, fists clenched. Caleb leaned in. No matter how this goes, you changed something. She nodded, but her throat was tight. She didn't want symbolic victories. She wanted Second Wind to survive. 20 minutes passed before the council returned. Jean Fletcher's expression gave away nothing. Rick looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Dalton cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. By a vote of 2-1, he said, the motion to revoke the operating license for Second Wind Center is denied. The room exploded. Cheers, claps, even gasps. Raven stood frozen for half a second before Caleb gripped her shoulder. George let out a slow exhale, murmuring, Well, I'll be damned. Jean stood to leave immediately, her jaw clenched, but she couldn't outrun the applause. Rick nodded once at Raven on his way out, a small gesture of something close to respect. Outside, people lingered in the heat, no longer whispering, no longer avoiding her eyes. Some offered handshakes, others soft words. But one woman, a longtime local named Marla, came up quietly and placed something in Raven's hand. A folded check. My husband was a vet, she whispered. He'd have wanted me to help. I'm sorry it took me this long. Raven didn't respond right away. She looked down at the check. $500. Enough to fix the broken fridge. Maybe even the roof, but more than that. It was proof. Proof that the tide had turned. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough to keep fighting. Enough to believe. That evening, the porch at Second Wind glowed with soft yellow light. Strings of old cafe bulbs stretched from the posts to the trees, casting a warm circle over the cracked patio stones. The kids were already asleep, their laughter now just echoes inside of the hallways. Raven sat on the top step, her elbows resting on her knees, the weight of the day finally beginning to settle into her bones. The town had spoken. Second Wind was still standing. But it wasn't just the building that felt more solid. It was everything. The air around her felt changed. Not lighter, exactly, but less heavy. As if the town itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Caleb walked up the path from the parking lot, 2 cold sodas in hand. He handed her one without a word and sat down beside her. They drank in silence for a minute. No need to speak just yet. They'd already said all the important things in front of the council. Finally, Caleb let out a low chuckle. You know, when I first rolled into this town, I figured I'd just pass through. Thought it'd be another bad story I'd forget by next week. Raven glanced sideways at him. You almost were. He smiled at that, nodding. Yeah, then you showed up with $20 and more backbone than the whole gas station put together. She shrugged. Someone had to. Sure, Caleb said. But you did. And look where we are now. He leaned back, gazing up at the stars just beginning to appear through the thinning clouds. You ever think it would turn out like this? Raven took a long sip before answering. Honestly? No. I thought I'd just keep scraping by, fighting every little thing alone. I didn't expect help. I didn't even expect anyone to notice. Caleb was quiet for a while, then said, You didn't get lucky. You got loud, in your own way. You made it impossible not to notice. That matters. Raven smiled faintly. Still feels like it could vanish tomorrow. Maybe, he agreed. But today, it didn't. And that's how it starts. The front door creaked behind them, and George rolled out slowly, a blanket draped over his legs. You two just gonna sit there philosophizing all night, he grumbled. Or are we gonna toast to the fact that we just made Jackson Hollow blink for the first time in 20 years? Raven laughed. Caleb stood up and helped George settle into a chair near the railing. Inside, someone had turned on the radio low. A bluesy guitar floated out through the window screen. They sat like that, the 3 of them, with the crickets and the stars, and the slow, steady hum of something real in the air, something earned, not applause, not headlines, but presence, that quiet, undeniable sense that they'd done something that mattered, not just for themselves, but for everyone who would ever walk through the doors of Second Wind after them. Raven took one last sip, then leaned back against the post and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself the peace of a moment that didn't need fixing. The world would keep spinning. The fight would come again. But tonight, they had held the line, and for once that was enough.